I'm really excited to be here today, and I have enjoyed listening to all these remarkable individuals who've spoken this afternoon. I've also enjoyed over the past few weeks spending some time wrestling with ideas around diversity and bias and how we can create ecosystems where individuals with a variety of perspectives, experiences, and strengths can flourish in the biosciences. Have you ever been on a team that's in flow? What an amazing feeling. One team member has an idea, and the rest of the team, they embrace it, they add to it, they commit to it, and you just get things done. I am here to tell you today that when you experience that feeling, it might be a good time to stop and take stock of whether you're making great decisions or just neglecting to consider other options and perspectives. If you don't have a diverse team, there's a good chance you're missing something. So teams with greater cognitive diversity complete complex challenges more quickly, although they probably do it with more conflict and disagreement. In the field of ecology, scientific papers that have at least one woman author are cited more frequently than papers with no women authors, and that citation rate is an indication that it's higher quality work. Companies that have more diverse executive boards have higher earnings and better returns on investment. Boards that have more women place fewer acquisition bids, and the bid premium is significantly reduced. Now, you might think, oh, it's bad to place fewer acquisition bids. But the reality is, they are preventing their companies from placing bad bids. So the reduction in that premium is an indicator that they're making better decisions. So I'd like to agree then that there is abundant evidence that diverse teams make better decisions and have better outcomes. And we know leaders get it, right? The leaders I work with, they talk all the time about the importance of diverse teams. They implement diversity initiatives. My question then is, why aren't diverse teams the norm? One answer to that question is bias. Now, everyone has biases. That's okay, that's human nature. The problem arises when you view your bias not as a bias, but receive it as objective truth and apply it as objective truth. So bias can come from lots of different places, whatever the source, whether it's gender, race and ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ identity, first-generation students, whatever it is. Maybe it's those three people on the right side of the room. It reduces opportunity when you implement bias for the underrepresented because they don't fit in. A few years ago, I attended a case-based professionalism manel at a conference. This conference has about 70% manels, so it didn't seem unusual to me. Now, the problem the employee that they were discussing was a new neuroanesthesiologist. And this neuroanesthesiologist was frequently reported by nurses, neurosurgeons, and others on that neuroanesthesia team with complaints ranging from yells at nurses during codes to cancels cases, the rest of the team doesn't. And yeah, technically, those decisions are supported by guidelines. It was very carefully gender neutral, but I was not surprised when I suddenly heard, now, she has been coached and counseled, and the problem continued. I raised my hand. Hey, is she the only woman neuroanesthesiologist? Yeah. Are any of the neurosurgeons women? No. So I asked kind of cautiously and with a lot of, trying to work around it, is it possible there are issues of bias that reflect how she's being treated? And the immediate response was, no, I have met with her and she is horrible. So here's some things you should know. Did you know that hospitalized patients who have Medicare and receive their care from women hospitalists have a lower mortality and lower readmission rates? Now, that's not because women are better carers. That's because women hospitalists are much more likely to follow the guidelines. And contrary to maybe what Nick was talking about, there's a lot of problems with guidelines. It is easy to shoot holes in guidelines. They're always controversial. There are lots of gray areas. We don't have perfect evidence. We need more research. But despite the fact that guidelines are flawed, we know that if you follow guidelines, outcomes are going to be better for a given population. Did you know that in scripted simulations where residents run the resuscitation after a cardiac arrest in a mannequin, high-fidelity mannequin, residents who identify as men are judged to have better leadership skills, even though they use identical language? Now, interestingly enough, though the men apparently have better leadership skills, code teams in the actual hospital that are run by a physician and a nurse who are both women have better outcomes with higher rescue rates and higher survival to discharge. So the way I viewed that, and what I discussed with my friends afterwards, though I did not convince the moderator, that neurosurgery team, they missed an opportunity to recognize and address their own bias and improve the care they deliver. And I'm kind of guessing that neuroanesthesiologist in question no longer works there. Now, you'll see from my story, I might not really be talking about big bias, that overt, conscious bias that explicitly discriminates. It's much less common today. People are much more aware of it. There are pathways to take away from it. I'm talking about small cuts and disadvantages, and they don't seem that individually damaging, but over time, the effect starts to add up. Like, consider the small pay gap that turns into a $1 million gap over the course of a career. So what is this importance of these little small cuts? Well, computer scientists from the University at Buffalo recently published a simulation on the effect of small amounts of bias, or what they call everyday sexism, on the advancement of women over time in an organization. They incorporated evidence-based gender bias of 6 types into their systems. There's a non-altruism penalty. So women who complain about gender bias that they experience reduce their own perceived promotability. I don't want to promote that complainer. There's a stretch project penalty. Men are more likely to be assigned stretch projects. And stretch projects are ones that when they're successful, you get a lot more promotability out of them. Individual and mixed group failures and successes. For women, when there's a failure, there's a greater decrease in their perceived promotability. And when there's a success, there's a smaller increase in their perceived promotability. So they put this all into their computer that I don't understand. Here are some of their data on these slides. So the x-axis is promotion cycles, and the y-axis is the percent of men at a given level in the organization. And the legend for the levels is color-coded on the right, and orange is the C-suite, level 8. So time 0 is at the start, when the company recruits an equal number of men and women to level 1. Level 8, as I said, is the C-suite. If there are no biases, which is that first box, by level 8, there are still about 50% women in the C-suite. If they add any one of those biases as a single bias, there's a variable impact with biases in assignment to stretch projects and the impact of individual failures and successes having the largest impact on delaying women's movement up through the hierarchy, which then concentrates more men in the higher levels. When you incorporate all the biases into the model, the effect compounds, and it's striking. Now, men make up 80% of the C-suite. You can imagine in real life, as probably in the life of that neuroanesthesiologist, the delay is also a source of frustration and often leaves women to not just stagnate and stay at a lower level, but to leave the company altogether. The authors published an opinion piece in the New York Times on October 14th of this year. I highly recommend taking a look at it. They've got an actual live model that you can watch go through this system. And in it, you can see the effect when women's performance is valued at just 3% on the top line or 5% less than men's. At 5% devaluation of women's accomplishments, there are half as many women at level 7, and by the time you get to the C-suite, there's only 2% women at level 8. I'm just wondering if this reminds any of you of your workplace, as it does sometimes remind me of mine. Now, I want to note that this is a study of gender bias. It does, though, show the large impact of small bias over time, and it is open source code for so the computer scientists among us could easily adapt it to incorporate literature on bias related to individuals from any group that's underrepresented in industry. And you can imagine, for individuals with intersectional identities, the various types of bias they experience could add up to much bigger consequences. As I hope I've convinced you, it's not about fixing the individual. If you recruit a diverse workforce and then you ask these individuals who have different backgrounds and perspectives and experiences and identities that you recruited because of those, and then you say to them, hey, you got to fit in to work here, we want to have flow on our team, it really defeats the purpose of diversity, right? If you aren't welcoming individuals as their authentic selves, their voice is muted. Not only that, when your voice is muted, when you can't show up as your authentic self, it's frustrating, and a lot of these people end up leaving. So you have a giant diversity initiative, you recruit a whole lot of people, and in the end, you have no net gain. So what can we do? Well, it's kind of boring, really, what we can do. The first thing is, let's focus on fair, transparent, and objective hiring, assignments, and promotion. Now, when I say objective, I'm going to remind you that bias can be perceived as objective. And so you also have to institute best practices like, say, a recruitment advocate who help reduce bias in what we call objective judgments. As leaders, we need to commit to reducing bias and opening opportunities more widely. Without bias and buy-in and effort from the top, diversity initiatives won't have any long-term effect, and I think we have all seen plenty of that in healthcare. So you might ask, Harriet, why do you care about this so much? You've kind of made it. You've had leadership roles. Here's why I care. Here are people who succeeded in the system, in the sciences, by fighting and at high cost. And we know of many of them not because we recognize them at the time of their work, but because there are groups of people now going around and identifying these people and highlighting them and putting out websites to remind people that other people have done this kind of work. What I think about are the people who didn't have the ability to thrive in this system, whose contributions were lost and whose contributions generally are still being lost because they just didn't have that ability to fight. Imagine if we had a system that uplifted people rather than pushing them down. Thank you very much.